For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cecilia Marie Roberts. I'm the Manager of Strategic Wellness Initiatives here at the county. And on behalf of the County Wellness, Diversity and Inclusion Committee and our colleagues at the museum, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation. We're really excited to be celebrating Black History Month by doing a little learning and unlearning, and I'm really happy to be introducing Mike, who's going to get us started, and he'll tell us a little bit about himself and get the webinar going. So over to you, Mike.
Perfect. Thank you, Cecilia. I appreciate it. It's nice to see some friendly, I want to say friendly faces, but I can only see names right now on my end. So some friendly names popping up on my screen. And for those of you who I don't know or don't know me, then it's very nice to see you and happy to be here. Yeah, so on behalf of the museum, I want to say thanks for having us. It said Emily originally, but I am the fill-in for this session. But I'm really excited to talk about the I guess the history of the Black presence in Wellington County, kind of just actions of those who came before us in this area and things like that, and highlighting some of just the really neat, interesting, and diverse stories from that. So what I'll do is I can share my screen. I will share it, and then I will pull up the PowerPoint. Hopefully that works. Okay, so I only see names on the side, and I don't see any, I don't know if I can see any thumbs up or anything like that on the side, but it looks like it's working from my end. And if it doesn't, then maybe just pop into the chat and let me know. But it looks like it is sharing. There's the thumbs up. Beautiful. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to get us started. I have some notes up ahead of me. So if you see my eyes kind of wander a little bit, then that is the reason as to why. But we have titled this was even well before me. The title of this chat is Freedom Fighters and the Black Settlements of Wellington County. That's kind of a play on words a little bit, because there is a lot of significant presence of African descent individuals who worked inside different military ranks and different conflicts over Canadian history, especially in this area, as well as fought for their own freedom, their own personal social, cultural freedom as well in the long run. So I always have really liked the talk. Of course, you'll hear some names that are super famous in the area. You will hear and maybe see some faces that you recognize from history class, but hopefully you learn some more things. I think that's the most important thing of anything like this. Anytime we do an outreach, we always like it when people can come away from it knowing something new, right? So coming away from it with a little bit more knowledge than they arrived with. So let me just, there we go. Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to start from some very early origins. So the transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade was one of history's largest forced migrations. What that means is essentially a group of people would move from one area to another, largely against their will or due to either being captured in a conflict due to the conflict itself. And that was, again, one of the largest ones in history. So it spanned from the 16th to the 19th century. If you want that in year terms, it'd be the 1500s to around the 1800s. And you can see on the map here kind of that general direction. It was called the Middle Passage through the Atlantic Ocean. So European countries were involved in it, mainly Western European countries: Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands. They forcibly transported approximately anywhere between 12 to 15 million sub-Saharan Africans across the Atlantic Ocean during that time period. Captives were primarily taken from West and Central Africa, which you can see there on the map. You can see things like the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, West Central Africa, like the Kingdom of Congo. And that was the largest where they were taken from. Now, each of those areas had independent states, kingdoms, just even empires in certain degrees. And they would sell to the European, I guess, slave traders who came along the coast and take them to the Caribbean, the southern United States, as well as Brazil. You can actually see the volume. I really like this map. You can see the volume of individuals that were transported as well. You can see up to the United States, and then, of course, a much more significant line in terms of volume to the Caribbean and to Brazil there as well. The trade itself destabilized a lot of those African societies and fueled the economies of colonial empires in the Americas and in Europe. Parallel to this, on the east coast of Africa, at the same time, there was another slave trade going on, the Arabic slave trade up into the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, Persia, and India. That was active from the 7th to the 20th century, so a little bit longer in scale, and transported between 6 and 10 million Africans as well northwards into those regions. So both the east and the west coast of the continent were deeply affected, and both trades left legacies of inequality, cultural displacement, things like that in their wake. But we're going to talk about specifically Canada. So slavery existed in what is now Canada during essentially most of the era of British colonialism. It was abolished as part of the wider British Empire in 1833, which was the same year that the British did it, but there is still a long history of African slaves being present in Canada, Upper and Lower Canada, so the two colonies that were established in this part of the continent. In addition to not just the British side, France also, slavery was also legal there. It was active alongside the French presence around the world, so not just in Canada, in Haiti, in other Caribbean islands, in parts of Africa. In 1794, which was the newfound French Republic, outlawed slavery in its colonies in that year in 1794, but the decree was never like officially implemented. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte, who I'm sure we all know the name of, reinstated slavery in France and its colonies, but it wasn't until the Second Republic permanently abolished it in 1848. So a similar timeline to the British colonies as well. So you can see that there was a legacy on kind of both fronts of colonial powers here in North America. Before any of this, however, the first recorded person of African descent to come to Canada, recorded, I say that's kind of a clear message. There is a fellow named Mathieu de Costa, who you can see there on the left-hand side. That was around 1605, and he was a part of the party alongside Samuel de Champlain. He was a free Black African at that time, and he was part of that party as well. Now, the earliest slave record we have, the earliest first recorded slave in New France, is an individual named Olivier de Jeunes. He arrived in Quebec in 1628 and was sold by his owner to a clerk of the colony. And again, like I said, was thus the first slave present that we have recorded. Again, other things that far back, 400 or 500 years ago, things can get a little bit blurry in terms of recording. So one historian of what I was able to find in certain records recorded that approximately 4,000 slaves by the end of New France in 1759, of which 2,472 in this particular study were Indigenous Americans, and just over 1,100 were Black Africans. So that is kind of that early history of the slave trade here. But again, we'll talk in terms of impacts down the line, what that looked like there as well. So let's talk about the two specific, the second specific colony, so Upper Canada. So we chatted first about Lower Canada. Let's talk Upper Canada. The question of slavery in Upper Canada was a little bit blurrier than Lower. There was no mention of Black African slavery in the British legal documents this kind of far up the river until 1790. So all of that kind of early history closer towards the coast, the St. Lawrence, things like that, we have a little bit more, but there wasn't a ton of legal documentation. Not to say it wasn't there, it likely was, but as far as the actual hard documents, the kind of the status of slavery in the early colony was a little bit more unknown. In 1790, though, an imperial statute allowed loyalists. Now, for those of you who don't know, loyalists are individuals after and during the American Revolution who were still allied to the crown, the British colonies, basically. Loyalists could enter the colony from the United States without paying a duty on their slaves, but only if they obtained a license from the lieutenant governor. Now, the lieutenant governor was the individual who was in charge of the colony, and we'll talk about what that looked like as well. So during that period, once we have a little bit more documentation, approximately 500 to 800 enslaved persons arrived with those loyalists to Upper Canada between 1783 and 1793. So about 500 to 800 people in that 10-year kind of span in there. So I want to start talking about, that was kind of your 10,000 foot view. I want to talk about some more specific stories, some more kind of humanizing side of things. I'll give you a heads up that some of the stories, some of the details in the next couple stories might be a little bit troubling. So I just want to give you that heads up just to be prepared. But let's talk about some more specific folks there. Sorry, my computer seems to be lagging a little bit. So the first one I have here is a story of an individual named Sophia Pooley. So this individual was born into slavery around 1772 in Fishkill, New York. Fishkill, New York is about, I want to say, I looked it up on a map, it was about 85 to 90 kilometers north of New York City. So if you draw a straight line north, it still exists. It's a small town there. At approximately age 7, Sophia and her sister were taken to Niagara and sold to Chieftain Joseph Brant, or Thandinija, who you might know about and obviously is a significant kind of player in this area. She lived with him and his family for about 5 years. During this time, she experienced abuse from Brant's third wife, Catherine. Specifically, we do have a story about that, who inflicted a facial wound on her that left a lasting scar that she would be known for kind of throughout her life. So I'm going to read a quick quote just describing, kind of in her own words, her kidnapping here. It says, "My master's sons-in-law came into the garden where my sister and I were playing among the currant bushes, tied their handkerchiefs over our mouths and carried us to a vessel, put us in the hold and sailed up the river. I know not how far nor how long. It was all dark there all the time. Then we came by land. I remember when we came to Genesee, there were Indian settlements there. I guess I was the first colored girl brought into Canada. The white men sold us at Niagara to an old Indian Brant, the king. I lived with old Brent about 12 or 13 years, as nigh as I could tell." Now that, again, I said earlier, she lived with him for a smaller period. There's some debate about the length of time. But it said Brent lived part of the time at Mohawk, part at Ancaster, and part at Preston, then called Lower Block. The upper block was at Snyder's Mills. So a little bit more detail on her kind of kidnapping and her story there. After that, however, once she was sold by Brant to Sophia and Samuel Hatt, were the individuals that she ended up being purchased by for $100. She lived with them for 7 more years before escaping to freedom. So she did escape. She later married an individual named Robert Pooley, which is where the last name come from, who eventually did abandon her in a very sad twist of fate. So in her later years, Sophia resided in the Queensbush settlement, which I will talk all about by the end of this presentation, don't worry, and lived into her 90s. So quite the life for Sophia Pooley, quite the up and down, many kind of tumultuous periods as well. And definitely some things to think about there. So Sophia Pooley was that first story I wanted to share. The second story is an individual named Chloe Cooley. Now, this is a very interesting one because Chloe Cooley was very much a catalyst towards abolitionist movements here in Canada. And you can see that both her and Matthew DaCosta were featured on stamps. I've included those pieces of artwork there. I find that very interesting. But she was a big catalyst. Her story was a big catalyst for early abolition sentiment in this part of the country. So a lot of slaveholders at that time were worried that slavery in Upper Canada might be soon abolished. There was a general kind of unease towards slavery at that time, so they began to sell their enslaved people across the border to the United States, where, of course, slavery remained legal for a significant period after the British eventually abolished it. One specific incident is Chloe Cooley. It's a pretty tragic incident, but it had long-lasting repercussions. So on the night of March 14th, 1793, an individual named Adam Vrooman, a loyalist settler, violently forced Chloe Cooley into a boat to transport her across the Niagara River to the United States. Vrooman tied up Cooley, beat her, and she screamed and resisted. Now, her cries are important because it drew the attention of an individual named Peter Martin, who was a Black loyalist and veteran of the Butler's Rangers. Now, the Butler's Rangers I'm going to talk about later as well, but keep that in your brain. So Peter Martin heard her and witnessed the abduction alongside another white man there in the area who is remaining unnamed. Together, they reported the incident to what was called the Executive Council of Upper Canada, saying that we saw this thing, we weren't able to stop it, but this happened and we wanted to report it to you. Now, Cooley's fate after she crossed the river kind of remains unknown. but the incident itself sparked a lot of attention. The executive council pressed charges against Vrooman for disturbing the peace, but the charges were ultimately dismissed, which was not uncommon for these kind of occurrences, as Chloe Cooley was viewed as legal property. So as far as disturbing the peace goes, that was not held up in a really unfortunate turn. But her story played a huge kind of key role in fueling debates around slavery in the area. And Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, who you probably are familiar with that name, and other in the Executive Council kind of took a lot of influence from that story and pushed for legislation to limit slavery inside of the colony. So let's move into that. What did that look like? So after this kind of push towards it, this growth of unease towards the institution of slavery, we then have a bit of a push for real tangible legislation. So as I said, John Graves Simcoe, picture right there, was a key figure in limiting slavery in Upper Canada. Fierce abolitionist even before the incident, but was super troubled by the whole institution, as well as the abduction of Chloe Cooley. And that was the big catalyst for change. He faced opposition from loyalist settlers. He introduced the Act to Limit Slavery in 1793. So that was kind of his big push. Even though he was getting that opposition from other loyalist settlers, he kind of went ahead with it anyway. So the Act to Limit Slavery, I have put it on the slide there. You can see the picture of it. That was in 1793, and that was an effort to essentially outlaw slavery, but to do it gradually and slowly because it was an entrenched part of certain economies and things like that. It was not, looking back, was not great. It wasn't an abolition of slavery, so I really want to make that point clear that this document was not something that abolished slavery altogether, not by any stretch, but it was a push kind of in that direction. So the slave, let's go through some of it. So the participation in the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in Upper Canada, making it illegal to import enslaved people into the colony. But the act did not emancipate those who were already enslaved. Sales of enslaved persons remained legal because they were still enslaved, while importation was prohibited from outside. Enslaved people could still also be brought across the border to the United States as well. That was still legal. Those who were already enslaved would remain enslaved for the rest of their life. However, one aspect of the act stipulated that children born to enslaved mothers after the year that it was brought in, so after 1793, would remain in bondage until the age of 25 and then freed. So all of these kind of pieces show the gradual approach to the outlawing of slavery, to phase it out over time rather than ending it immediately. So I said, not great. Definitely a push towards the abolition, but again, kind of not the final step. So in 1798, so a few years later, legislative attempts to expand slavery kind of flared up a little bit in Upper Canada, but was unsuccessful. A bill introduced in the same year sought to allow the importation of additional enslaved people, but it faced resistance kind of across the board and didn't really go anywhere. So you had some flare-ups again to try and expand it, but it was largely unsuccessful. So I wanted to go over these few stories, talk about the larger institution of what slavery looked like here, because I think a lot of people hear about the United States, which had slavery for much longer. It was such a significant fueler for things like the Civil War. A lot of people kind of forget that slavery existed and was certainly an institution that was deeply rooted here in Canada, or what would become Canada, Upper and Lower Canada. And so I really want to talk about that. So let's turn the focus a little bit towards Black settlers of Wellington County. Now, a very interesting piece is that some of the earliest non-Indigenous people to live in this area were African descent from the United States, who were fleeing north. And early settlers from Wellington County were certainly of Black descent, of African descent. And I think that's a really, really interesting aspect just of the story of Wellington County more broadly. So I want to talk about that. And of course, kind of the individual who's painted there, who kind of everyone knows about, is Richard Pierpoint. So I'm going to pull that up and change this over. There we go. So let's talk about Richard Pierpoint. He is a super significant individual here in the county, in the history of the county. And I think, honestly, a really major Canadian, just as far as the whole Canadian story goes. So let's chat about him. So he was born around the year 1744 in Bundu, a small West African state, kind of in the interior of West Africa, that Saharan region, what is now kind of southwestern Senegal, or sorry, southwestern Senegal is the ocean, southeastern Senegal. And it was, you can see it on the map there, kind of interior, surrounded by a bunch of other kind of pre-colonial states that were in that area. Bundu was a predominantly Muslim region, and it's almost guaranteed that Pierpoint himself would have grown up as a Muslim and in a Muslim household, surrounded by the culture and religious influences of the area. They had a lot of Islamic trading across the Sahara at that time, major Islamic kingdoms all through for hundreds and hundreds of years in that region as well. So Bundu was one of them. Now, Pierpoint's early life in Bundu would have revolved around communities' indigenous traditions, local traditions, as well as aspects of Islamic culture practices there, and very heavily reliant on agriculture and trade, and kind of just raw materials as well in that area for the Saharan trade routes. So around 16 years old, Pierpoint was captured during a conflict or a slave raid, we're not 100% sure, which was common at the time due to the pressures of the Atlantic slave trade, which I talked about. Slave raiding inland was very common. Bundu, just like many other African states, was both a victim of the slave trade and a participant in it. A lot of European countries couldn't go very far inland because of tropical diseases, because of unfamiliarity with languages, direction, things like that. So they would stay at the coast, and oftentimes kingdoms would bring slaves down rivers, river systems, trade routes, things like that, to trade with them. Now, in the long run, that led to pretty significant destabilization of other trade markets, and would drive up slavery in the region and severely impact these states, and Bundu was one of them. So in the long run, it had extremely kind of negative effects on these inland kingdoms. So Pierpoint was sold to European slavers in that area, and endured the Middle Passage, as I talked about, across the transatlantic journey. Him, along with millions of others, really inhumane conditions, brutal, kind of a brutal journey. Many didn't survive the trip, but Pierpoint, of course, did. When he arrived, he was sold immediately into slavery, would change what his name was originally to Richard Pierpoint. Many enslaved individuals would change their religion. He was also likely one of those. And his capture kind of marked a complete severance from his homeland culture, forcing him to adapt a way of life in kind of a foreign land over here. So he made some waves here when he, as he lived the remainder of his life over here. So let's talk about the American Revolution. When that began in 1776, the British offered enslaved men opportunities for freedom in exchange for military service. This policy kind of aimed to weaken the American rebellion by recruiting African Americans and loyalists to fight against the kind of American rebels. So by 1870, Pierpoint enlisted with the Butler's Rangers, which was a loyalist militia. I mentioned that before. It was a unit known for its guerrilla tactics in this part of the continent. So the regiment was made up of diverse recruits, not just Black individuals. It also included Indigenous allies, European settlers, and along with folks like Pierpoint, who were formerly enslaved individuals. So the Butler's Rangers were instrumental in conducting raids, defending British interests along those frontiers, and particularly kind of up here around the Great Lakes. So this was really in around the area that they were fighting. So following the British defeat, which of course, because the United States exists, the British were defeated in 1783, many loyalists, including some of the members of the Butler's Rangers, resettled in British-controlled territories, so of course north of that border. Pierpoint was among those, and he settled in the Niagara area. So as a reward for a lot of these loyalties and service and things like that, Pierpoint was granted 200 acres of land towards the end of the 18th century, 1788, near what is now present-day St. Catharines. So that's where he first got his land grant. Sorry about that. As many other Black loyalists, though, in that area, the land was often kind of poor quality and difficult to farm, very purposely done by a lot of those kind of British colonial officers. They knew that the farm wouldn't be as good, so they would give those to Black loyalists as opposed to white, and make it kind of a challenging to establish a livelihood in that area. So he did face hardships on farming, limited resources, kind of marginal land. So he either sold or abandoned his land grant. We're not 100% sure of that aspect. But then he supported himself through kind of manual labor jobs and odd jobs here and there, which was really, really common for a lot of Black loyalists after those land grants were given out. But this period specifically kind of marks a really important chapter in Pierpoint's life, and really kind of highlights the resiliency and kind of wider struggles by Black loyalists. So that I really, really kind of want to drive that point home, that it wasn't super easy for them, even though it might sound like they got a land grant, quote unquote. So, of course, he came over as a slave. He then participated in the American Revolution, and he also was adjacent and involved in other military organizations in the War of 1812. So he's closely associated with what was called the Color Corps during the War of 1812, and advocated for its creation to defend Upper Canada. So the British approved the unit. It was led by white officers, but Pierpoint was, sorry, he was likely too old to fight by then. But his leadership in kind of pushing for something like that and help organize Black soldiers during the conflict was really, really significant. So Pierpoint himself kind of pushed for and advocated an establishment of something like the Colored Corps. So it was a distinguished kind of and unique unit of Black soldiers who served in the War of 1812. It ran through the whole course of the war, all the way until 1815. Now, there was certain battles that it notably contributed to, that the Corps notably contributed to, like Queenston Heights, which you've probably heard about, Fort George, which you've probably heard about. But it was largely not during those larger conflicts, relegated to non-conflict roles. So like labor for scouting, things like that for the remainder of the war. But after the disbandment, the men of the Colored Corps continued to serve in essential support roles in the military, building fortifications, maintaining supply lines, performing garrison duties, all these different things they would still participate really strongly in. And these tasks were really critical to the war effort. So ensuring security of key locations, continued functioning of military operations, all of that stuff. Now, this wasn't uncommon. A lot of other Canadian militia units would shift in roles. So that wasn't just because it was the Colored Corps, because as the war kind of progressed, things changed in the war. But Pierpoint did play a significant role in kind of getting that Colored Corps up and running, and really advocated for that kind of position. So after his service during the War of 1812, like I said, this guy's life is wild. He has done a whole lot. And so after his service in the War of 1812, Pierpoint was entitled to a 100-acre land grant, which was a really kind of a standard reward for veterans of that conflict. In 1821, by this point, he would have been probably around his mid to late 70s, so he wasn't a kid anymore. Pierpoint petitioned the government for passage back to Bundu, which is very interesting, instead of accepting the land grant. So he said, instead of 100 acres, I want to go home, back to Bundu. So this kind of rare request, it was uncommon that you'd see this, but it really highlights kind of his enduring connection to his roots. And even though he remained in Upper Canada, the request was denied by the Crown, but he did push to go back to Bundu, which is really significant, right? After a whole lifetime, decades in this area, that he was still kind of drawn back home. And actually, I have a picture here of the actual petition to the Queen to return to Bundu, so you can see the request mark there. And again, like I said, it was rejected, and he was forced to stay in Upper Canada. But now that we've talked all about his, in my opinion, very wild life, he is such an interesting individual, let's talk about Pierpoint's role in his community then. So let's rewind a little bit from his older life to talking about what kind of community he established. So in the 1820s, Pierpoint played a super important role in establishing a Black settlement, was what became known as the Queen's Bush, which again, in this area you may have heard about in history classes, things like that. It is located in present-day Wellington County, as well as other counties, but there are bits of it here as well. The community was part of a broader movement of freed and formerly enslaved Black individuals seeking to kind of establish a self-sustaining community, right? And establish safety also, right? Inside Upper Canada, ideally free from racial prejudice, economic hardships, things like that. So that was kind of the goal of the Queen's Bush. It was founded on government-granted lands and purchased plots, but many settlers, including Pierpoint, faced kind of poor quality soil as well there, just like he did back in St. Catharines, as well as inadequate resourcing. That is really important too. If you don't have the resources to farm even poor quality land, then you won't get very far. So even though these challenges were kind of rife in their community, the settlers pooled all their skills and labor to build homes, clear land, and create a community that prioritized kind of mutual support and survival. So it was actually kind of a really cool story of overcoming these hardships together through kind of a communal effort. It became a haven for Black settlers and freedom seekers from the United States. Especially those who were coming up through the Underground Railroad. The Queen's Bush was definitely a stop, if not a final destination, on that Underground Railroad, which is why it's kind of so significant and why the Queen's Bush, in my opinion, really kind of shows that resilience and determination of those individuals. And Pierpoint was again one of those early leaders and advocates for those kind of for that kind of place, for the Queen's Bush specifically. So let's talk about some of the other, sorry, hang on, something's going on my screen here. There we go, okay. So the Queen's Bush was established by Pierpoint, but I want to get away from Pierpoint a little bit and talk about kind of larger ideas towards slavery at that time, and then I'll tell you a couple more stories as well. So after the act against slavery, remember I was talking about Simcoe and that act to start kind of the beginning of the end of slavery. No further action was taken by Canadian legislatures, but maybe on a positive note, the kind of that push led towards something very positive in the long run, which was the abolition of slavery in 1833 in all British colonies. So like I said, we had those early pushes like the Act Against Slavery in the 1790s. You had other bills kind of not just in Upper Canada, all over European colonies around the world. And those were kind of those early pushes. And eventually in the 30s, it was finally outlawed in all colonies, including Canada. However, in the United States, it was a very different story and a very sad story. In the North, slavery began to fade away by the late 18th century, similar to how it gradually disappeared in Canada. Economic shifts were kind of going towards industrialization and smaller scale farming. So slavery was less viable in the area. So many northern states began enacting gradual abolition laws, just like we saw here in 1793. However, on the other hand, the southern economy relied heavily on large-scale plantations, growing really labor-intensive cash crops like cotton, tobacco, sugar, all these different things. Slavery was a deeply entrenched aspect of the southern economy and culture, and it remained highly profitable in that agricultural system, unlike it did in the northern states or Canada. So some people have coined this a slavocracy, is a word that some people have used, where kind of political, social, and economic systems revolved around maintaining slavery as an institution that drove the economy. So as abolitionist movements in the South gained traction, those Southern slaveholders increasingly kind of enacted harsher laws and punishments, economic systems, things like that, to suppress resistance and maintain that control, which is kind of what prompted the Underground Railroad to flee to either those northern states or to Canada itself. That's where we see a lot of these people like refugees, freedom fighters, all these different things. There were laws put in place to kind of demonstrate the reach of slavery. You have things like the Dred Scott decision, which you can read more about on your own time. I am cognizant of that it's everyone's lunch hour. Other acts there in the area that was essentially put forward. I'll use the Dred Scott as an example. It was a Supreme Court ruling that declared African Americans, whether free or enslaved, as not U.S. citizens and having no legal rights, while also affirming that Congress could not ban slavery in federal territories. So a lot of these pushes to keep these people down and to keep these institutions strong. And of course, they did go to war over very, very big differences between the South and the North. Slavery was a significant chunk of that. But that did drive the Underground Railroad, which you can see. This is a very interesting picture of some of the spots along the Underground Railroad there as well. So you can see a lot of the routes, the kind of locations, and you can even see the Queen's Bush there on the map, right by Toronto. And so that was a very, very kind of big part of this part of Ontario's history there as well. I might just move over a slide really, really quick. Oh no, hang on. There we go. So Canada, while it was a safe haven, in kind of quotes there, it did attract people fleeing slavery, but it was not entirely safe from extradition attempts under kind of American pressure. There was still, even though white Canadians were opposed to slavery on the kind of the large whole, there were still prejudices that went around. There was paternalism, casual racism, ignorance, kind of acted alongside these freedom movements, which is a very kind of strange system. So even though people came north, even though they settled in Canada, it was not still a particularly great time. Now, I do want to tell you one story just before I wrap up. I have a couple more slides to go through, but I would be amiss if I didn't talk about this fellow right here, John Little, John and Louisa Little. He's a very, very interesting guy. He was born as a slave in North Carolina. At the age of 23, his life was upended pretty significantly when his owner went bankrupt and sold him. So it separated him from his family. So he was raised or born into an enslaved family, but he was separated when his owner sold him. So he was sent on his own. So that kind of marked the beginning of repeated sales and brutal punishments as he sought freedom. But this guy endured, let me tell you. So in one instance, John was severely beaten after being bought by someone else along his journey. He was severely beaten after being caught trying to visit his mother. He was trying to go back and visit her. Despite these risks, his determination to reunite with his loved ones never really wavered. He was eventually sold to Tennessee, even further south and kind of inland, where he met a woman named Louisa, who would become his wife. But only 9 months into their marriage, John was sold again, forcing them apart. So this is not the first time this guy has been sold by his family. Determined to escape, he attempted to flee, but was recaptured yet again. Later, he made another daring escape, but this time came back after his escape for his wife, Louisa. He was able to get her as well, and they both journeyed to freedom. It was fraught with danger, with conflict, with secrecy along the whole route. Louisa as well endured severe hardship before she could break free, so she has a pretty significant story as well. And together, both of them did eventually escape to Canada and settle in the Queen's Bush, which, as I said, by that point was a really big kind of refuge for freedom seekers in that area. And they were able to rebuild their lives among that Black community kind of up in this area. So he is a pretty significant individual there as well. So let's talk about the decline of the Queen's Bush. Obviously, the Queen's Bush settlement is something from history, so let's talk about why that is. So there were two key factors that led to the decline of the Queen's Bush. It was the American Civil War and government land surveys. So the first one, let's talk American Civil War. So that was from 1861 to 65. Many young Black men from the Queen's Bush kind of joined the Union Army to fight against slavery, leaving the community with fewer workers and leaders. So again, these folks were escaped to freedom up here, but still felt that connection to the South. They might still have family. Maybe wanted to fight, maybe wanted to go south as well to reunite with their family should the Civil War be a success on the side of the North. So they did still have that connection to the United States as well. So that, again, reduced workers, reduced leaders. The more significant reason was government intervention and land surveys. So the Ontario government surveyed the Queen's Bush around that era. and open it up for sale, because again, they came up and they founded, they got these land plots originally, but this is officially when the Ontario government surveyed the Queen's Bush and opened it up. So Black settlers who were already living there were given the right of first purchase for the land they had improved, but many couldn't afford it, which is a really, really brutal hand to be dealt. Speculators of the land, so people who are interested in purchasing it, often exploited that and bought the land first, and thus displaced families out of the area. So John Francis was one individual. He was a community leader who advocated for what were called, quote unquote, squatters' rights, which ensured settlers had the chance to buy their own land properly. He really pushed for it. He got a lot of people on board to push for proper purchase of their land, for lower fees, for an affordable amount. But despite his efforts, financial barriers, racism in the system did eventually lead to the settlement's decline, with families dispersing to the cities or to the United States. So that was the kind of final end to the Queen's Bush there. Now, as the last thing I want to talk about, just before we wrap up, I want to talk about our site right here that we get to work at here, which is a wonderful place. But there were hints, even by 1877, when the poorhouse here, the Wellington County House of Industry and Refuge, when that was built, even in 1877, that there was still some Black settler communities still in the area. Granted, by then it was much, much less than it would have been before. But as the poorhouse kind of specifically goes, African descent was the only other ethnicity to get marked down in the registry book, but it was very sparingly. So out of 1,400 inmates, out of many, many people who lived here between 1877 and 1947, only 4 individuals of African descent have been identified. So their names, I want to read them out, were Mary E. Hill and John Palmer of Peel Township, William Grote of Guelph Township, and a male resident admitted in the 1940s, who, according to some of our records, can't be identified due to kind of current privacy legislation. But it was really important to know that there were people here in the poorhouse, in the House of Industry and Refuge, who were of African descent, and a lot of people in the area, even by then, were still descended from the Queen's Bush. And there are still plenty of people in Wellington County who are descended from individuals who came up here through the Queen's Bush. It still kind of really, really does continue. And the last slide we have is, of course, significant places in the county and things like that that have happened, either events, books, signage, Ontario Heritage Trust, stuff like that, graves, things like that. And the legacy definitely has not been forgotten over the course of the county's history. But with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I can pass it back over to Cecilia if you want to wrap up. But I want to say thanks a ton for tuning in, and it was really, really cool to chat about some of this stuff.
Wow, Mike, thank you so much. I have so many questions, and so I think that coffee is going to be in order for you and I. But I know everybody, this was a quick lunchtime presentation. We are going to record it, or we have recorded it. I probably should have told you that at the beginning. Eek. Anyway, we have recorded it. We're going to try and post it on the County Wellness DNI pages, and we'll stick it up on the banner. So encourage your colleagues who weren't able to get here today to have a look. And yeah, so many questions are coming up for me, Mike, and so maybe we will have to have, another kind of maybe a panel or some kind of Q&A about the Queen's Bush, specifically. Maybe that's a great way to celebrate next year as we continue this conversation around recognizing and celebrating the diversity, not just within Wellington County, but here in the county, within our colleagues and friends and family. So thanks so much for your time and your expertise, and have a great day, everyone. Okay, take good care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye now. Thanks so much, Mike. I think if I just leave the meeting, then we're going to get the recording, and I'll clean it up before I send it in.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. And
Mike.
oh, sorry.
I said that was just amazing. Thank you.
No problem. Nice to chat, Peter. Nice to see you on the recording again. But
yeah.
all the best,
I
guys.
know it's hard talking to, like, when you can't see real people. I know that's probably disconcerting. All righty, will you
Awesome.
take good care?
Thank you.
We'll see you soon. Take care.
See ya.
Bye-bye.